Before my wife and I got married 8 years ago, her parents insisted I sign a prenup. At the time, I found it quite offensive. It was already clear that they didn't fully accept me into their family, and making me sign a legal contract just felt like further proof of their distrust. Back then, I was working in sales when I met my wife. A year into our relationship, I decided to leave my job and launch my own electronics brand. We were both 27 at the time, and by the time I officially got my business up and running, I was almost 28. Throughout it all, my wife was incredibly supportive. She was genuinely excited to see me pursuing my dreams. Her parents, however, were far less enthusiastic. They believed I was living off her money, which wasn't entirely wrong. She did support me financially to some extent since I wasn't earning a steady income yet. But it wasn't as if I was completely dependent on her. When I was 29, I proposed, and within a year, we were set to be married. A few months before the wedding, her parents approached me and laid out their conditions. I had to sign a prenup. The contract stipulated that in the event of a divorce, all our assets and finances would remain separate. I wouldn't be entitled to anything belonging to her, and she couldn't claim anything of mine. On top of that, I would be required to reimburse my wife and her parents for any financial support they had provided while I was building my business. Since her parents had occasionally sent money to help us out, they saw it as a debt I owed them, a clause that felt unnecessary and frankly insulting at the time. I suspect they added a provision stating that my wife wouldn't have access to my assets either, just to make it seem fair. The prenup even included terms about joint accounts, dictating that any money we pooled together would be divided according to individual contributions, because they simply assumed my wife would always be the primary breadwinner. When they handed me the contract, they made it clear signing was the only way they would ever truly accept me as their son-in-law. Fast forward to today, and the situation has taken an ironic turn. Over the years, my business took off, and now I'm worth 5 times more than my in-laws. Suddenly, they want the prenup dissolved. They're furious that I refuse, accusing me of not loving their daughter enough, and even manipulating her into threatening me with divorce. The same agreement they once insisted was necessary to protect their daughter is now inconvenient for them. And now, they're trying to guilt-trip me into changing it. The prenup was insulting for several reasons. First, it was based on the assumption that I would always be financially dependent on my wife and never achieve anything on my own. That was not only unfair, but also completely inaccurate. I was already working tirelessly to build my business so that I wouldn't be a burden on her or anyone else. Second, their disdain for me wasn't new. Even before I left my job to start my business, they had never truly liked me. From the moment my wife introduced me to her parents, they made it clear that they didn't think I was good enough for her. And by good enough, I mean rich. For context, my in-laws own a successful real estate firm and have done well for themselves. They come from wealth, and financial security has never been an issue for them. I, on the other hand, grew up in a middle-class household. My father was a high school football coach, and my mother managed a coffee shop. We weren't struggling, but we certainly didn't have the kind of money my in-laws were used to. From the start, they looked down on me. Their disapproval came in the form of snide remarks, passive-aggressive comments disguised as jokes, and an overall dismissive attitude. I chose to ignore it, even though it bothered my wife. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd gotten under my skin. At the end of the day, my wife and I loved each other, and that was all that mattered. I didn't need their approval. So when they handed me the prenup, it stung, but I signed it anyway. My wife, however, was furious. She knew exactly what they were doing, trying to humiliate me right before the wedding in hopes that I'd back out. But we had talked about it beforehand, and she signed it too, without hesitation. We both understood their real motive. They wanted to push me aside and steer her towards someone they considered more suitable. Unfortunately for them, their plan failed. My wife and I have always been a team, and that wasn't going to change. That was years ago. Since then, I've poured everything into my business. I kept pushing forward, and over the past 2 years, things took off exponentially. Between social media marketing and relentless hard work, everything finally started paying off. As of now, I'm worth nearly 5 times what my in-laws are. And just like that, their tune has changed. A few days ago, they came over for dinner. After we put our son to bed, they asked us to sit down for a talk. With serious expressions, they told us they had been thinking about it for a while and believed it was time to dissolve the prenup. Apparently, after all these years, they suddenly felt it was unnecessary. How convenient. My wife looked genuinely surprised, and even I was caught off guard for a moment. But after the initial shock wore off, I decided to decline. I told them, straight to their faces, that I didn't think dissolving the prenup was necessary. After all, they had once insisted that it was the only way they'd feel safe accepting me as their son-in-law. I wouldn't want them to lose that sense of security. Of course, I was being sarcastic, and they definitely picked up on it, despite my best attempt to sound sincere. They tried to reason with me, saying that years had passed, we now had a son together, and they no longer had any doubts about me. But I stood my ground and made it clear I wasn't interested in discussing it any further. That's when things got tense. They started insisting that, since the prenup had been their idea in the first place, I should now respect their wishes and agree to dissolve it. According to them, they were older, wiser, and only looking out for our best interests to prevent any bitterness in the future. Honestly, I had no idea what they were even talking about. After going back and forth for a while, I told them that my wife and I had no plans of getting divorced, so there was no reason to even be having this conversation. But they refused to let it go, and before I knew it, the argument escalated. Years of pent-up resentment started spilling out. I finally laid it all out. I told them that they had only pushed for the prenup in the first place to humiliate me and remind me that I wasn't in their financial league. Now that I had surpassed them, they wanted to pretend none of it ever happened. Their excuse was that they had only been looking out for their daughter, making sure she was financially secure in case I turned out to be a gold digger. They framed it as a precautionary measure, a safety net. This back and forth went on for a while, and eventually, I just got too exhausted to keep arguing. I told them I was done with the conversation and that they needed to leave. I thought I was being completely reasonable. Our voices were getting too loud, my son was asleep, and it was late. I just wanted some peace so I could get some rest and clear my head. But, of course, they took offense. Instead of leaving, they hit me with the classic guilt trip. According to them, I only got to where I am today because of the support they and their daughter had given me. Now, that's where I completely disagree. They never supported me. They supported their daughter. Yes, I acknowledged earlier that they occasionally sent us money while I was building my business, and I was genuinely grateful for that. But that money wasn't for me. It was for their daughter. We could have managed without it. I had savings and was more than willing to use them. But my wife always told me not to, saying that her parents had plenty of money and that they wouldn't mind helping her out. So yes, they provided financial support. But let's be real, it was only ever for her sake. As for emotional support, that was non-existent. They never welcomed me, never treated me like family, and never had any faith in me. And now, after years of looking down on me, they had the audacity to claim I wouldn't have achieved success without them? Absolutely not. I got here on my own, and they had nothing to do with it. So they had no right to act like they did. When I told them the truth, that they had nothing to do with my success, they completely lost it. They started yelling even louder, furious that I dared to be ungrateful after everything they supposedly did for me. The argument escalated even further, and at some point, they turned to my wife and demanded that she make a choice. According to them, they had supported our relationship for as long as they could, but since I refused to acknowledge their contributions, they had reached their limit. Somehow, my wife managed to de-escalate things enough to get them to leave. Since then, we haven't spoken. She's kept in touch with them and has been trying to get them to apologize, even though I've made it clear that I don't need one. I don't care about apologies. I just want them to stay out of my life. They are welcome to visit my wife and maintain their relationship with our son, but as for me, I need space. After everything that happened, I have zero interest in trying to repair things with them right now. Honestly, this fight was inevitable. I'm surprised we managed to avoid a confrontation for as long as we did. But now that it's finally happened, I just want to move on and keep my distance. However, things took a turn when my wife showed me something last night that completely changed the way I see this situation. She had been trying to convince them to apologize and acknowledge how badly they had treated me over the years. But instead of taking responsibility, they had been trying to manipulate her into divorcing me. She was visibly upset when she handed me her phone, showing me a series of messages from them. She had been trying so hard to keep things peaceful for the sake of our son. He adores his grandparents, and she didn't want to create unnecessary tension in the family. To be honest, neither did I. But after reading those messages, I'm not so sure anymore. They refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing and acted as if they had every right to treat me the way they did, even if it was humiliating. Not only did they defend their past behavior, but they also doubled down on their narrative that I was ungrateful. And now, because of my so-called ingratitude, they think my wife should reconsider our marriage before it's too late. According to them, the fact that I won't dissolve the prenup must mean that I'm suspicious of my wife now that I have money of my own. And because I won't bow down to them, it's proof that I don't truly love her or respect her family. It's absolute nonsense, but they're pushing it hard, hoping to manipulate her into walking away from our marriage. Thankfully, my wife isn't buying any of it. She's just exhausted from trying to reason with them. The only thing she slightly agrees with is that, whether I like it or not, they did provide us with some financial support in the early days when she was covering most of our expenses. But I don't see why I should acknowledge that as some grand gesture of generosity. It wasn't done for me. It was done for their daughter. If my wife had allowed me to, I would have used my savings, and we wouldn't have needed them at all. They didn't help out of kindness. They helped because they didn't want to say no to their daughter. And regardless of whatever financial assistance they provided, it doesn't change the way they treated me. They always looked down on me, assumed I was only with my wife for money, and never accepted me as family. I've already dealt with the consequences of that for years, and I'm done pretending like I owe them something. You're definitely not the asshole for refusing to be thankful to your in-laws, especially given the way they treated you from the start. They didn't support you, they supported their daughter. Any financial assistance they provided wasn't out of generosity toward you, but because they didn't want to say no to her. And considering how they always looked down on you, assumed you were after her money, and only saw you as an outsider, it's completely reasonable that you don't feel like you owe them gratitude. That said, it's good that you're open to repaying them if they explicitly ask for it. That's fair. But even without direct repayment, your wife never had to financially struggle once your business took off, which balances things out. Your frustration about the timing of the prenup discussion is completely understandable. It's not about the prenup itself. It's about how they still don't trust you and continue to undermine your role in the family. They only want to dissolve it now because the financial dynamic has shifted in your favor, and that hypocrisy is what stings the most. It's not about fairness, it's about control. The biggest red flag here isn't even their past behavior. It's the fact that they are actively trying to manipulate your wife into divorcing you. That proves they still don't see you as family and never truly accepted you. They're not looking out for her. They're trying to take back control. At the end of the day, your relationship with your wife is solid, and that's what matters. If you both decide to dissolve the prenup on your own terms, without pressure from her parents, then that's your choice as a couple. But your in-laws' motivations are clearly selfish, and you have every right to be upset about it. Hey everyone, it's been a week since the fight with my in-laws, and after reading through different perspectives, I've made up my mind. I'm going to return all the money. I've come up with a reasonable figure, and since I'm doing well financially, I'd rather pay them back than have this hanging over my head forever. I don't want to feel indebted to them, and I certainly don't want to live under the expectation that I should be endlessly grateful just because they helped their own daughter financially in the early days. The best way to put an end to this is to give them back every penny they claim to have contributed. I talked it over with my wife, and she agrees that this is the best course of action. Her parents have not stopped trying to manipulate her into divorcing me, insisting that I've disrespected them too many times. Of course, they conveniently ignore the fact that they've disrespected me, and even my family, on multiple occasions. If they can't handle being treated the way they've treated others for years, then they never should have acted that way in the first place. Honestly, I think I was quite polite in the beginning. It wasn't until they started making things personal and going below the belt that I lost my patience. Meanwhile, they've been openly hostile toward me since day one, never even pretending to like me or accept my family. Given all of that, I think my reaction was more than reasonable. After years of suppressing my feelings and trying to be the bigger person, I finally had enough. By paying them back, I'll officially owe them nothing. Not financially, not emotionally, not in any way. They never supported me in any meaningful way, and neither my wife nor I have the energy to keep dealing with their drama. Writing them a check seems like the quickest way to put an end to it all. Normally, I don't believe that throwing money at a problem is the solution, but in their case, it's probably the only thing that will work. because that's all they care about. I honestly can't imagine any other parents in the world trying this hard to sabotage their own daughter's marriage, especially when a child is involved, just because their ego matters more than her happiness. They love to act like they have her best interests at heart, but in reality, the only thing they truly care about is themselves, their image, and their pride. Update 3. It's been a little over 2 weeks since the fight with my in-laws, and over the past few days, my wife has stopped responding to them. She realized it was a lost cause. She tried everything to explain why they were wrong, but all they did was keep pushing her to file for divorce. She got tired of fighting a battle they clearly had no interest in resolving. Since they made it clear that they weren't willing to fix things, she decided to cut contact. That's when they decided to show up at our house today. I was the one who opened the door, and they didn't even acknowledge me. They just barged in, calling out for my wife. At this point, their behavior isn't even surprising anymore. They've spent so much time accusing me of being disrespectful, yet they continuously prove themselves to be complete hypocrites. I didn't say a word. I just stood there and waited for my wife to come out. When she finally did, she immediately shut them down. She told them she had no interest in speaking to them unless they were willing to acknowledge our side of things. But instead of having an actual conversation, they jumped straight into confronting her about her disrespectful behavior. According to them, she was now becoming just like me, rude and ungrateful. And if I was indebted to them, so was she. She shouldn't forget that. The moment they said that, my wife completely lost her temper, and rightfully so. She told them straight up that she never asked them to do anything for her. Everything they did was of their own free will, and now they had no right to hold it over her head.